In the 1950s, China pushed industrial growth and urban expansion at a speed few countries had ever attempted. Cities grew outward, infrastructure cut across grasslands, and land was reclaimed with little regard for long-term ecological cost. The result was not abstract. Wind erosion intensified, topsoil disappeared, water tables dropped, and large areas of land began to harden into desert. Over time, this process turned from a regional problem into a national one. By the early 21st century, deserts were threatening roughly 1/4 of China's total land area, and about 15% of its territory had already been degraded within just a few decades. This was not only an environmental issue, it was an economic one. Official estimates cited in the original analysis point to annual losses of around $50 billion from reduced agricultural output, damaged infrastructure, and recurring dust storms. These storms did not politely stop at national borders. They carried sand and fine particles across East Asia, affecting air quality and farmland in neighboring countries. What began as local land misuse became a transnational liability. The political response followed a familiar Chinese pattern: scale. Rather than treating desertification as a collection of local failures, Beijing framed it as a systemic threat requiring a systemic solution. The logic was blunt. If land degradation was spreading across northern China like a slow-moving invasion, then the response had to resemble a defensive structure of equal size. That framing gave birth to what would later be marketed as the Great Green Wall, officially known as the 3 North Shelter Forest Program. The idea was not subtle: plant trees at a continental scale, block wind, stabilize soil, and slow the deserts down. This was not about aesthetics or environmental symbolism. It was about buying time for food security, social stability, and economic continuity. Critics often forget this context when they reduce the project to a vanity exercise. China was not trying to win applause. It was trying to stop a measurable loss of land, money, and control. From the start, the project carried an implicit admission of past mistakes. Rapid development without ecological safeguards had produced real damage, and the bill had arrived. The question was no longer whether intervention was necessary, but whether intervention on this scale could actually work without creating a new set of problems. That question hangs over the entire project and will define every phase that follows. The project that later became known as the Great Green Wall officially began in the year 1978, at a time when China was quietly reassessing the environmental cost of its earlier development push. The government framed the initiative as a long-term afforestation program, stretching across the northern, northeastern, and northwestern regions of the country. These areas formed a broad arc of ecological vulnerability, where grasslands and semi-arid zones were steadily giving way to sand. From the beginning, the scale was deliberate. The plan called for tree planting across roughly 88 million acres of land, much of it near or around the historic Great Wall region. This was not an isolated conservation project run by specialists behind closed doors. It was designed as a mass mobilization effort. In 1979, China institutionalized a National Tree Planting Day, held every year on March 12th. On that day, students, workers, soldiers, and officials were expected to pick up shovels and plant trees. Participation was framed less as a choice and more as a civic duty. Over the following decades, this approach produced staggering headline numbers. According to figures cited in the original analysis, more than 78 billion trees were planted nationwide within a few decades. The official objective was equally blunt: raise forest coverage in northern China from roughly 5% to 15%. In policy terms, this was not about biodiversity or ecological elegance. It was about coverage, density, and physical barriers against wind and sand. The project also carried an economic rationale that often gets overlooked. Beyond slowing desert expansion, the shelter forests were meant to supply timber, stabilize rural incomes, and reduce pressure on farmland lost to erosion. In other words, the trees were expected to pay rent. This dual purpose explains why the program survived leadership changes and economic cycles. It was not framed as environmental charity, but as infrastructure. From a Western perspective, the approach can feel heavy-handed. From Beijing's perspective, it was consistent. If desertification was a national-scale risk, then the response had to be national, visible, and compulsory. Whether that logic translates into lasting ecological success is a different question. But as a policy design, The Great Green Wall was never vague about its priorities or its methods. One reason the Great Green Wall was never treated as a purely domestic project is simple geography. Northern China sits upwind of much of East Asia. When deserts expand and vegetation collapses, the consequences do not stay local. The Gobi Desert alone has been advancing steadily for decades, swallowing grassland at a rate measured in thousands of square miles over time. Each year, large sections of land lose their ability to support agriculture, and the exposed soil becomes airborne. The dust storms that follow are not minor weather events. They reduce visibility, damage crops, clog infrastructure, and push fine particulate pollution deep into urban centers. According to the framework laid out in the original analysis, these storms also cross borders, degrading farmland and air quality in Japan, North Korea, and South Korea. In other words, desertification in northern China exports risk whether anyone agrees to it or not. This is where the project's logic shifts from environmental protection to strategic risk management. Reducing dust storms is not just about saving trees or soil. It is about protecting supply chains, public health systems, and political stability. When sandstorms shut down roads, delay flights, or trigger health alerts in major cities, they carry economic and social costs that compound quickly. Seen through this lens, the Great Green Wall looks less like a green experiment and more like climate infrastructure. There is also a quieter political calculation at work. By investing heavily in large-scale land stabilization, China positions itself as a responsible regional actor rather than a source of environmental spillover. It is no accident that officials frequently emphasize reduced dust storm frequency when discussing the program. This is measurable, visible, and difficult to dismiss. Critics sometimes frame the project as performative, but that ignores the practical incentives. No government wants to be known as the country that buries its neighbors in sand. Planting trees, building shelter belts, and fixing dunes may not win cultural awards, but they lower friction across borders. In that sense, the Great Green Wall functions as a form of preventative diplomacy, built out of soil and roots rather than treaties. Whether the trees can keep up with the pace of climate pressure remains uncertain, but the motivation behind the effort is clear. This is not only about stopping deserts, it is about limiting downstream damage, both literal and political, from a problem that refuses to respect national lines on a map. By the early 2000s, it became clear that planting trees alone was not enough. Large sections of northern China were simply too dry, too unstable, or too degraded for conventional afforestation to survive on its own. The response was a shift from mass planting to technical intervention. The Great Green Wall stopped being just a tree project and started looking more like a land engineering program. One method involved using aircraft to spread seeds across areas where soil moisture was still marginally viable. This allowed vegetation to establish without heavy ground disturbance. In drier zones, the state introduced direct financial incentives for farmers who agreed to plant drought-resistant shrubs instead of traditional crops. The logic was transactional and unapologetic. If the land could no longer support food production, it would be repurposed to stop sand from moving. Engineers also changed how plants were arranged. Instead of continuous forest strips, trees and shrubs were planted in checkerboard patterns designed to break wind speed and lock sand in place. In some regions, stone grids were added next to vegetation to help form a hardened crust on the soil surface. These were not cosmetic choices. They were attempts to stabilize terrain that had already crossed the line from fragile to hostile. This technical turn produced results that were easier to measure. In late 2024, international media reported that China had completed a green belt roughly 3,000 kilometers long around the Taklamakan Desert, the largest desert in the country. This was not a symbolic milestone. It marked the first time an external outlet confirmed that a continuous vegetation barrier of that scale actually existed on the ground. The emphasis on measurable outcomes is important. For years, critics dismissed the Great Green Wall as an exercise in inflated statistics. A 3,000-kilometer belt is harder to wave away. It either reduces sand movement or it does not. Satellite imagery, dust storm frequency, and land stability data will eventually settle that argument. What this phase shows is a shift in mindset. China stopped treating desertification as a moral problem and started treating it as a technical one. Less talk about planting trees for the future, more focus on structures that work under present conditions. Whether these interventions are sustainable in the long run is still open to debate, but they mark a clear departure from the early belief that scale alone could overpower climate and geology. Between the years 2012 and 2022, the Great Green Wall entered its most aggressive expansion phase. According to the original analysis, afforestation and land restoration campaigns during this decade covered roughly 960 million mu, equivalent to about 64 million hectares. This was not incremental progress. It was a surge, driven by tighter national targets and a growing awareness that earlier gains could easily be reversed if momentum slowed. The numbers look impressive on paper. Forest coverage increased, degraded land was stabilized, and more than 12 million mu of wetlands were restored or expanded. Officials often highlight that the total number of trees planted nationwide now exceeds 66 billion. A figure meant to convey both effort and permanence. Put differently, the land area affected by these projects is comparable to the size of an entire European country. That comparison is intentional. It frames the program as continental in scale, not experimental. What changed during this period was not just speed, but integration. Desert control began to overlap with energy policy. In several northern regions, large solar farms were installed in desert zones, serving a dual purpose. The panels reduced wind speed at ground level, limited sand movement, and created microclimates that made vegetation more viable. At the same time, they fed electricity into the grid. This hybrid approach turned previously unusable land into an economic asset. By the mid-2020s, China had linked these efforts to broader energy goals, including plans to reach hundreds of gigawatts of installed solar capacity by the year 2030. Desert regions were no longer treated solely as liabilities to be fixed. They were reframed as platforms for infrastructure. From a policy standpoint, this matters. Projects that generate power and revenue are easier to defend than projects that only promise long-term ecological benefits. This is where the Great Green Wall becomes harder to classify. It is no longer just an environmental intervention. It is land use reform tied to energy security and industrial planning. Supporters call this efficiency. Critics call it mission creep. Both sides are right. What is clear is that desertification control has been pulled into the center of China's economic strategy, not left at the margins where green projects often end up. For all its scale and ambition, the Great Green Wall has never been free of failure, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. One of the earliest problems was survival. In many desert and semi-arid zones, newly planted trees died quickly. Daytime heat spiked, nighttime temperatures dropped sharply, water was scarce, and soils were thin or saline. In some areas, large portions of seedlings failed within a single season. Planting was easy, keeping trees alive was not. Early phases of the program leaned heavily on monoculture. Large areas were planted with the same species to simplify logistics and reduce cost. On paper, this looked efficient. In practice, it created ecological fragility. Uniform forests drained soil nutrients, attracted pests, and became vulnerable to disease. A single outbreak could wipe out millions of trees. Critics were quick to point out the irony. A project designed to stop land degradation risked creating new forms of ecological instability. Water added another layer of concern. As forest coverage expanded, so did demand on groundwater. Several recent scientific syntheses have shown that large-scale tree planting can alter regional water cycles. In northern China, increased vegetation has been linked to shifts in water distribution, in some cases reducing available water downstream or in already stressed basins. This is not speculation. It is a measurable hydrological effect. Trees do not just block sand, they drink. There is also the issue of deserts themselves. Contrary to popular belief, deserts are not empty wastelands waiting to be fixed. They contain unique mineral compositions and play a role in global dust and nutrient cycles. Large-scale transformation risks disrupting processes that are poorly understood. Some ecologists argue that certain areas should be stabilized, not forested. That distinction rarely makes it into political messaging. These critiques do not invalidate the project, but they do change how success should be measured. Fewer dust storms are a win. Healthier soil is a win. But declining water tables, dead plantations, and long-term maintenance costs are part of the same balance sheet. Governments tend to celebrate ribbon cuttings. Nature sends invoices later. The uncomfortable truth is that there is no clean victory here. Desertification control at this scale is an ongoing trade-off between damage control and unintended consequences. The Great Green Wall did not eliminate risk. It redistributed it. Whether that redistribution proves manageable is the question that will define the next decades of the project. By design, the Great Green Wall is not a short-term campaign. It is scheduled to run until the year 2050, which already tells you how the Chinese government views the problem. This is not a project meant to produce quick political wins. It is a long test of governance, patience, and adjustment. The official lesson learned over 4 decades is blunt. Planting trees is easy, but building living systems that survive heat, drought, pests, and economic pressure is not. That realization has slowly shifted priorities. Later phases of the program place more emphasis on native species, mixed planting, fencing, vulnerable zones, and working with local ecosystems rather than forcing uniform solutions. Individual contributions are also highlighted more openly. Figures like Yin Yusen, who transformed thousands of hectares of barren land into productive green space over decades, are held up as proof that long-term commitment matters more than headline numbers. This is a subtle but important change in tone. Central planning still dominates, but survival on the ground depends on local adaptation. Internationally, China has begun exporting its experience. Through partnerships linked to the Belt and Road Initiative and global desertification forums, Chinese researchers and agencies share techniques ranging from sand barriers to soil-binding materials. Some of these methods are experimental. Others are already being tested abroad. Whether this represents environmental leadership or strategic influence depends on where you stand, but the knowledge transfer is real. The core question, however, remains unresolved. Has the Great Green Wall stopped desertification, or has it only slowed it down? The honest answer is that it has done both. In some regions, desert expansion has clearly been reduced. In others, progress is fragile and dependent on continuous input of money, water, and labor. This is not a failure. It is the reality of managing land under accelerating climate stress. In the end, the Great Green Wall is less a miracle solution than a working prototype. It shows what happens when a state treats ecological collapse as infrastructure risk rather than a background issue. The outcome will not be judged by slogans or tree counts, but by whether future generations inherit land that is stable enough to live on without constant emergency intervention. Thanks for watching, and we would like to know what you think about this approach to fighting desertification. So leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below.